Look at me when I am talking to you. I am not playing these games. You owe us an apology, and you are going to give it right now. You are going to listen to me right now. I demand that you apologize to my staff immediately.
Your demands mean nothing. Get out of my sight before I have you thrown out.
Yeah.
Don't you dare sit there and act innocent. You know exactly what you did, and everyone here sees it. I don't care who you think you are, and you are going to listen to me right now. I don't care who you think you are. You are finished here. Get out of my restaurant right now before I call security myself. I don't care who you think you are, and you will not talk to me like that ever again.
The accusation took barely 5 seconds to voice. 5 seconds that curdled the salt air of the Hamptons, silenced the clink of heirloom silver against bone china, and turned a sun-drenched lunch service into a confrontation that could never be taken back. Zora Vance felt the shift in the atmosphere instantly. The bright, glass-walled bistro grew heavy and static, as if the panoramic ocean views were closing in to trap them all. She had barely leveled her accusing finger before the elite world around her stopped moving. She stood there, the picture of righteous fury, her Hamptons apron sharp and her expression a mask of absolute defiance. She was ready for the fallout, ready to be fired for breaking the "customer is always right" mantra. But the man in the wheelchair didn't look away, didn't bark a denial, and didn't signal the 2 imposing bodyguards flanking him like stone gargoyles. Shin Jin-ho sat there, a stony monolith of iron and secrets, his presence casting a long, dark shadow over the mahogany table despite the midday sun. His presence was suffocating, shoulders squared like a fortress even in his seated position, his expression unbothered by the public yell. It was a terrifying, quiet power, the kind that didn't need to stand because his stillness alone was a death sentence. If this opening gripped your soul, smash that like button and share this story of ultimate loyalty. Subscribe and hit the bell. The lunch rush at the Glass Pavilion wasn't just a service, it was a performance of high-altitude ego, and Zora Vance was its most vigilant conductor. As the midday sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting sharp, diamond-bright reflections off the expensive silverware, Zora moved through the dining room with a grace that bordered on lethal. To the vacationing hedge fund managers and the women draped in linen and silent resentment, she was a blur of efficiency. But to those who worked alongside her, she was something else entirely, the gatekeeper. Zora didn't just deliver plates, she enforced a moral code and a zip code that had long ago traded ethics for access. She was known for a righteous fury that simmered just beneath her starched white collar. It was the way she stood, shoulders back, chin tilted, as if she were the one granting these titans of industry permission to breathe her air. She had earned her reputation the hard way, once famously refusing to serve a senator who had spoken dismissively to a busboy, standing her ground until the manager was forced to choose between a campaign donor and the best waitress on the Atlantic coast. They had kept Zora. Integrity, it turned out, was the only thing the wealthy couldn't buy, and they were fascinated by her possession of it. On this particular Tuesday, the air felt thin, charged with the kind of static that precedes a summer storm. Zora adjusted a set of dessert forks at a corner table, her eyes scanning the room with the clinical precision of a hawk. She saw the way the sunlight hit the sweat on a nervous junior associate's brow and heard the predatory lilt in a billionaire's laugh. This was her domain. She knew who was cheating on their taxes and who was cheating on their wives, all by the way they gripped their wine stems. "Table 4 needs more water," Zora, a younger server whispered, his voice trembling. "And he's being difficult." Zora didn't blink. She smoothed her apron, the fabric crisp enough to cut glass. "Difficult is just a word people use for men who think their money makes them tall," she replied, her voice a low, steady hum. She turned toward the center of the room, her gaze locking onto a new arrival. In a world of loud linen and louder watches, the man in the wheelchair was a silent, dark anchor. He sat framed by the blue of the ocean, a monolith of iron-gray stillness flanked by two men whose suits were tailored to hide the bulk of something more dangerous than a wallet. Most saw a tragedy in that chair, Zora saw a challenge. She felt the familiar heat of her fury beginning to stir, a slow, rhythmic pulse in her temples. In this unfair world, she was the only one who didn't look away, and today, she decided, the gatekeeper would be making no exceptions. The heavy oak doors of the glass pavilion swung open, admitting a draft of salt air and a silence that moved through the room like a physical weight. Shin Jin-ho didn't enter so much as he was installed into the space. The high-tech hum of his wheelchair was a low, mechanical growl against the polished marble, a stark contrast to the melodic clink of crystal that usually defined the dining room's acoustics. He was a monolith of charcoal wool and tempered steel, his face a mask of such profound stillness that he seemed to pull the light away from the vibrant ocean views. Zora watched him from the periphery, her hands tightening around a leather-bound wine list. She had seen powerful men before, but Jin-ho carried a different kind of gravity, the kind that came from surviving an erasure. Yet, as she moved closer to orchestrate the seating, her red began to snag on the two men flanking him. They were broad-shouldered and sharp-featured, dressed in suits that cost more than her annual rent, but they didn't carry themselves like the protective detail of a beloved leader. There was a subtle, jagged edge to their vigilance. They didn't scan the room for external threats, their eyes remained locked on the back of Jin-ho's neck with a cold, proprietary hunger. When the chair came to a halt at table 12, one man stepped forward to lock the wheels with a force that felt like an act of incarceration rather than assistance. They stood too close, looming over the man in the chair, their shadows overlapping his frame until he was nearly eclipsed. In the sharp Hampton's light, they didn't look like guardians shielding a titan, they looked like jailers presiding over a fallen king, waiting for the precise moment to let the iron gate drop. Jin-ho remained unbothered, his scarred hands resting flat on the mahogany table with a weight that suggested he still owned the ground beneath him, even if he no longer commanded the men behind him. Zora felt the familiar, hot prickle of her righteous fury. It wasn't just the arrogance of the wealthy that stirred her today, it was the suffocating scent of a betrayal in progress. She stepped into the static-charged air of their circle, her jaw set. Most would see a man who was broken, but Zora saw a man who was being buried alive by his own shadow. She cleared her throat, the sound a sharp, defiant crack in the oppressive silence. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice dropping into that low, steady hum that commanded the attention of every monster in the room. "I trust we're ready to see the menu, or are we just here to occupy the space?" The silence that followed Zora's words didn't just linger, it solidified, turning the ambient noise of the restaurant into a vacuum. One of the bodyguards, a man with a jaw like a steel trap, moved half a step forward, his hand drifting toward the inner lining of his blazer. The threat was tectonic, a silent promise of violence that usually sent staff scurrying into the shadows. But Zora didn't move. Her gaze was anchored to the table, specifically to the empty space where a diamond-encrusted watch had rested moments before. "I asked a question," Zora said, her voice rising just enough to catch the attention of the surrounding tables. The righteous fury that defined her was no longer a simmer, it was a flashpoint. She felt the eyes of the Hamptons elite turning toward them, the soft, pampered faces of people who had never been told no, now witnessing a woman with nothing confront a man who looked like he could buy and sell their souls. She leveled a finger at Shin Jin-ho, the tip of it trembling not with fear, but with the sheer force of her indignation. "Mr. Sterling's watch is gone. It was on that side table when you arrived, and now it's vanished into the shadow of your chair. I suggest you return it before the police turn this exclusive lunch into a crime scene." The accusation took barely 5 seconds to voice. 5 seconds that curdled the salt air and turned the sun-drenched bistro into a kill zone. The air grew heavy and static, as if the panoramic windows were closing in to trap them all. Behind her, she heard a tray of glasses shatter, a busboy's nerves giving way, but Zora didn't blink. She held the finger steady, pointing at the cripple in the wheelchair as if she were a judge delivering a verdict. Jin-ho didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon, and he didn't offer a denial. He simply sat there, a monolith of iron and secrets, his dark eyes reflecting Zora's defiant face with a chilling, clinical interest. For the first time, the jailers behind him looked genuinely unsettled, their proprietary hunger replaced by a sharp, murderous confusion. They looked to Jin-ho for a signal, a nod, a word, a death sentence. But the silence held. In the high-stakes theater of the Hamptons, the power dynamic had just been violently subverted. A waitress in a starched apron had just brought a global ghost to his knees without firing a shot, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped moving. Zora waited for the explosion, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, unaware that she hadn't just accused a thief, she had just lit the fuse on an empire. The air in the pavilion reached a freezing point, the kind of absolute zero that preceded a total collapse. Zora kept her finger leveled, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her eyes never wavered from Shin Jin-ho's face. She expected a roar of denial, a signal for the men behind him to break her, or at the very least, the cold dismissal of a man who considered her beneath his notice. Instead, the corner of Jin-ho's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smirk of derision, but something far more unsettling, a flicker of genuine, fascinated curiosity. For a man who lived in a world where everyone either bowed in fear or plotted in shadows, Zora's open, unfiltered defiance was a statistical impossibility. "The watch," he repeated, his voice surprisingly melodic, carrying a raspy edge that suggested it hadn't been used for anything as trivial as conversation in a long time. He didn't look at his bodyguards. He didn't look at the diamond-clad diners who were now whispering behind their menus. He looked only at Zora, his dark eyes tracing the line of her trembling finger back to the fire in her gaze. One of the jailers leaned down, his voice a low, murderous hiss. "Boss, let me handle this. I'll take her to the back end." Jin-ho raised a single, scarred hand. It was a slow, deliberate movement that carried more authority than a physical blow. The bodyguard stopped instantly, his face contorting with a mix of frustration and suppressed rage. The jailers were hungry for blood, eager to use this public insult as a reason to exert their will, but the man in the chair was still the gravity around which their world orbited. Jin-ho turned back to Zora, and then it happened, a slow, stony smile that didn't reach his eyes but transformed his face into something human and terrifying all at once. It was the smile of a predator who had found something more interesting than its prey. "You are very certain of yourself, Miss Vance," he said, reading her name from the silver pin on her apron. "Most people in this room look at this chair and see a man who cannot stand. You look at me and see a man who can steal." "I see a man who thinks the rules don't apply to him," Zora countered, her voice holding steady despite the static in the air. Jin-ho's smile widened by a fraction of an inch. He didn't reach for his pockets. He didn't offer an excuse. He simply leaned back, his shoulders relaxing into the leather of his chair as if he were settling in for a long-awaited performance. "Then by all means," he whispered, his eyes gleaming with a sudden, dangerous light. "Search me. But be careful, Zora. Sometimes, when you go looking for a thief, you find something much, much worse." Zora didn't move to search him. Instead, she let her hand drop to her side, her fingers brushing the rough canvas of her apron as she widened her focus, shifting from the man in the chair to the perimeter of his world. In the high-stakes theater of the glass pavilion, every movement was a telegraph, and Zora was finally reading the wire. The restaurant, with its shimmering walls and open horizons, suddenly felt less like a luxury bistro and more like a transparent cage, a glass fortress where every exit was watched by eyes that didn't belong to the house. She looked at the two men standing behind Jinho. Up close, the static coming off them was deafening. They weren't looking at her anymore, they were looking at each other, a silent, serrated communication passing between them in the tightening of their jawlines and the rhythmic tapping of a finger against a thigh. It was a countdown. They didn't care about the watch. In fact, as Zora scanned the table again, she caught a glimpse of a dull, metallic reflection tucked deep into the side pocket of the lead bodyguard's blazer. The realization hit her like a physical blow, colder than the salt spray off the Atlantic. The watch hadn't been stolen by the man in the chair, it had been harvested by the men standing behind him. They were using her righteous fury as a distraction, a way to paint Jinho as a common criminal in a room full of people who valued reputation above life itself. They were waiting for her to escalate, waiting for the police or the manager to arrive so they could claim their leader had become a liability, a broken man with broken morals. Zora looked back at Jinho. He was watching her realize it. His expression remained a stony monolith, but there was a subtle shift in the depth of his gaze, a silent acknowledgement that she had finally seen through the glass. He was a king in a fortress of his own making, but the walls were closing in, and the guards were the ones holding the keys. The air in the VIP section grew heavy and suffocating, the sun-drenched room suddenly feeling draped in the shadows of a coup. She saw the lead guard's hand tighten on the handle of Jinho's wheelchair, the knuckles white, the movement possessive. They weren't protecting him, they were holding him in place for the kill. Zora felt her fury shift, sharpening from a blunt instrument of accusation into a needle-thin tool of survival. She had spent her life being invisible to men like this, but now, her invisibility was the only weapon Jinho had left. She took a step closer, leaning in as if to inspect the table, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely traveled past the mahogany edge. "The watch is in his pocket," she breathed, her eyes locked on Jinho's. "And they aren't waiting for the check. They're waiting for the end." The silence between Zora and Jinho became a private sanctuary amidst the growing hostility of the dining room. Her whisper hung in the air, a thin thread of truth in a room woven from lies. Jinho didn't flinch at the revelation, instead, his eyes darkened, the amber depths turning to slate. He had known the daggers were coming, but he hadn't expected a waitress in a Hamptons bistro to be the one to spot the steel before it struck. Zora pivoted slightly, her professional mask returning even as her mind raced. She caught the reflection of the lead guard, Park Sun-hee, in the polished surface of a nearby wine cooler. He was adjusted his cuff, a smug, infinitesimal twitch of his lips betraying his confidence. The heirloom watch wasn't just jewelry, it was a prop in a meticulously staged play. By planting it on Jinho and allowing Zora to make a public scene, Sun-hee was creating a loss of face so catastrophic that the syndicate's elders would have no choice but to demand Jinho's removal. A leader who couldn't keep his hands off a diner's trinkets was a leader who had lost his mind, and a man who had lost his mind was no longer fit to hold the crown. The righteous fury that usually drove Zora to shout now turned cold and calculated. She realized that her outburst had been the final ingredient they needed. She had been the unwitting executioner, providing the clamor and the crowd for Jinho's public shaming. If she backed down now, they would simply find another way to finish him. If she pushed forward with the accusation, she was pulling the trigger for them. She reached for a fallen linen napkin near Jinho's will, her movements fluid and subservient, masking the tactical shift in her soul. As she bent down, she saw the subtle bulge in Sun-hee's jacket, the stolen weight of the watch. The betrayal was complete, the trap was sprung, and the sun-drenched bistro was about to become a slaughterhouse. "I made a mistake," Zora said, her voice projecting clearly to the neighboring tables, though her eyes remained locked on the man in the chair. The diners gasped, the sudden shift in the drama catching them off guard. Sun-hee's eyes narrowed, his hand drifting toward his waist. Zora stood up, the napkin draped over her arm like a shield. "The watch isn't with this gentleman," she announced, her voice a low, steady bell that cut through the murmurs. "I see now that the thief is still standing. And he's much closer than I thought." She felt the air turn lethal. The jailers realized the script had changed, and the glass fortress of the pavilion was about to shatter. Zora didn't look away from Jinho. For the first time, the monolith looked back at her with something that wasn't curiosity or power. It was a silent plea for an exit. The air in the pavilion snapped with the sound of 1,000 unspoken threats. Zora didn't wait for the bodyguards to recover from her redirection, she moved with a sudden, purposeful urgency toward the service station. Her righteous fury had transformed into a cold, tactical clarity. She had seen the way Sun Hee's eyes had flickered toward the kitchen pass-through just moments before, a look of expectant hunger that had nothing to do with the stolen watch and everything to do with the final course. "Wait," Zora commanded, her voice cutting through the rising murmur of the dining room as a junior server approached table 12 with a silver-domed platter. The young man hesitated, the tray trembling in his hands. Sun Hee's hand shot out, grasping the server's wrist with a bruising force. "The boss is hungry," the guard hissed, his eyes fixed on Zora with a promise of annihilation. "Let him eat." Zora didn't stop. She stepped into the narrow space between the guards and the man in the chair, her presence a thin, starched barrier. She didn't look at the guards, she looked at the steam rising from the roasted sea base. To any other eye, it was a masterpiece of the bistro's culinary arts. To Zora, who knew every scent of the glass pavilion like a mother knew her child, the aroma was jagged. The delicate scent of lemongrass and butter was being choked by the faint, metallic tang of bitter almonds, the calling card of cyanide. "There's a hair on the plate," Zora lied, her voice flat and undeniable. She reached out, not for the tray, but for the heavy crystal water carafe on the table. With a fluid, practiced motion, she tripped, sending a gallon of ice-cold water surging across the linen and directly into the center of the steaming dish. The sound of the splash was like a gunshot. The delicate sauce was ruined, washed away in a slurry of gray water and broken ice. The silence that followed was visceral. Sun Hee's face contorted, his mask of professional composure shattering to reveal the monster beneath. He surged upward, his hand finally clearing the holster beneath his jacket. But before he could level the weapon, a heavy, scarred hand clamped onto his forearm. Shin Jinho hadn't moved a muscle in his lower body, but his grip was a vice of iron. He was looking at the ruined meal, then up at Zora. He saw the way she was breathing, fast, shallow, but her eyes were steady. She wasn't looking at the gun, she was looking at him, a silent confirmation that the mistake she had just made was the only reason his heart was still beating. "It seems the service today is quite clumsy," Jinho murmured, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that forced Sun Hee to go still. The boss looked at the guard, his gaze an icy blade. "Perhaps we should take our coffee in the kitchen, Zora. I find I've lost my appetite for the dining room." The back hallway of the pavilion was a narrow, fluorescent-lit artery that felt miles away from the salt-air luxury of the dining room. Zora led the way, the wheels of Jinho's chair clicking rhythmically against the linoleum. Behind them, Sun Hee and the other guard trailed like looming predators, their footsteps heavy and syncopated. When they reached the heavy steel door of the dry storage room, Jinho raised a hand, stopping the procession. "Stay outside," he commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum. Sun Hee bristled, the bulge of the weapon at his waist a silent protest, but the raw, cold authority in Jinho's eyes forced him to bank his fire. The door swung shut, muffling the world of the bistro into a hush of grain sacks and tin spices. Zora leaned against a stack of flour bags, the adrenaline finally ebbing and leaving her hands with a faint, visible tremor. "You knew," she breathed, her voice a ghost of its former, righteous fury. "You knew they were trying to kill you before I even spilled the water." Jin-ho looked up at her, the harsh overhead light catching the silver scars that traced his jawline. He reached into the small leather pouch attached to his chair and pulled out a small, wooden bridge from a cello, a delicate, curved piece of maple that looked out of place in his scarred palm. "I was a cellist before I was a ghost," he said, his voice dropping into a register of profound, melodic grief. 10 years ago, in Seoul, I had a brother. Not of blood, but of the bow. We played together in the same conservatory. I thought he was my anchor. I thought he was the only person who saw the man behind the shadow of my father's empire. He turned the wooden bridge over in his fingers. He was the one who cut the break lines. Not because he hated me, but because he wanted the seat I occupied. He didn't want me dead, he wanted me exactly like this. Dependent. A legend in a box. He looked at the heavy steel door, knowing son he was on the other side. Betrayal isn't a sudden strike, Zora. It's a slow erosion. They don't take your life all at once, they take your legs, then your name, then your dignity. They plant watches and poison fish to prove you are a ghost who needs a medium. Zora looked at the man in the chair and didn't see a criminal or a cripple. She saw a soul that had been refined by fire and then left to cool in a vacuum. Her prejudice against the elite felt hollow, replaced by a crystalline understanding of the stakes. He wasn't just fighting for an empire, he was fighting to keep the last pieces of his humanity from being stolen by the men who called themselves his protectors. "I'm not a medium," Zora said, her voice steadying as she met his gaze. "And I don't follow scripts." Jin-ho tucked the cello bridge back into his pouch, a faint, stony light returning to his eyes. "I know. That is why we are going to walk out of here, Zora. And you are going to show me the way through the shadows of your kitchen." The steel door hadn't even fully latched before the first muffled concussions of gunfire erupted from the dining room. The sound was a series of sharp, rhythmic cracks that vibrated through the concrete floor of the dry storage room. Zora's righteous fury didn't vanish, it sharpened into a cold, jagged edge of instinct. She didn't scream. Instead, she threw her weight against a heavy shelving unit, sliding it across the door as a makeshift barricade just as a heavy impact shuttered the metal from the outside. The service lift, Zora breathed, pointing toward the back of the room where a rusted, industrial dumbwaiter was used to haul crates of vintage wine from the cellar. "It's built for weight, and it opens directly into the delivery tunnels." Jin-ho moved with a startling, practiced efficiency. He didn't wait for her to assist him, he rolled his chair toward the lift, his arms, the only part of him that jailers hadn't been able to break, moving like pistons. He looked at Zora, his eyes reflecting the flickering fluorescent light. "If you stay, you are just another witness they have to erase. If you come, you are a traitor to their order." "I was never a part of their order," Zora countered, hitting the call button. The lift groaned, a slow, mechanical protest that felt like it was echoing through the entire building. The door to the storage room buckled. A bullet punched through the steel, whistling past Zora's shoulder and embedding itself in a sack of flour, sending a white puff of dust into the air. She didn't flinch. She grabbed the handles of Jin-ho's chair and shoved him into the narrow, dark maw of the lift just as the shelving unit gave way with a screech of tortured metal. As they descended into the cool, damp darkness of the wine cellar, the sounds of the massacre above faded into a low, rhythmic thumping. The air down here smelled of oak, cork, and ancient dust. Zora knew every inch of this subterranean maze, every blind corner where the sommelier hid his private stash, every low-hanging pipe that could catch an unfamiliar head. "Wait," she whispered as the lift hit the bottom. She didn't lead him toward the main exit where the sirens would soon be wailing. Instead, she navigated the chair through a narrow aisle of Bordeaux crates, toward a heavy wooden door disguised as a decorative rack. Behind them, the service lift began to rise again. Son, he was coming back for them. Zora killed the lights, plunging the cellar into a velvet blackness. She reached out in the dark, her hand finding Jin-ho's shoulder. She felt the iron tension in his frame, the stillness of a man who had spent a decade waiting for this moment. Left, 3 paces, then a sharp right, she commanded softly. In the glass fortress of the pavilion, Zora was the only one who truly knew the layout of the shadows. She wasn't just a waitress anymore, she was the architect of his escape, leading the fallen king through the bowels of her kingdom while the monsters searched for him in the light. The shadows of the delivery tunnel were cold, smelling of wet concrete and the exhaust of a world that didn't know it was about to change. Zora pushed the wheelchair through the final heavy door, emerging into a secluded alleyway where the salt air was thick and the sounds of distant sirens were already screaming toward the pavilion. She stopped in the center of the asphalt, the dim yellow light of a single street lamp casting their silhouettes into long, jagged spears. A moment later, the door behind them burst open. Son, he stumbled out, his suit jacket torn, his face a mask of sweating, desperate rage. He leveled his weapon at Jin-ho, his chest heaving. It doesn't matter, son, he spat, his voice cracking. The elders already have the footage. A thief and a cripple. You're done, Jin-ho. The watch alone is enough to bury you. The watch is a lie, Zora said, her voice a low, steady bell that cut through the chaos of the sirens. She didn't flinch as Sun He swung the barrel toward her. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out her smartphone. You forgot that in a glass fortress, everyone is a witness. But I'm the only one who was recording the reflection in the wine cooler. She pressed play. The screen glowed with a grainy but undeniable video of Sun He's hand sliding the heirloom watch into his own blazer while Zora was distracted. The betrayal was no longer a whisper, it was a digital ghost, haunting the very man who had conjured it. Sun He's finger tightened on the trigger, but Jin-ho spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a gavel. Justice, Sun He. Not mercy. From the darkness of the alley's far end, 3 black sedans pulled to a silent, predatory halt. The real elders of the syndicate stepped out, men who valued the absolute integrity of a leader's word above all else. They didn't look at the gun in Sun He's hand, they looked at the evidence on Zora's screen. You used a civilian to strike at me, Jin-ho said, his voice rising from the chair like a physical force. You used her righteous fury to hide your own cowardice. You didn't just steal a watch, you stole the honor of our house. The elders moved in a silent, synchronized wave. Sun He's weapon was stripped from his hand before he could even blink, his legacy ending not with a bang, but with the cold click of handcuffs and a forced descent into the shadows. Jin-ho turned his chair to face Zora. The stony monolith was gone, replaced by a man who looked exhausted but finally, truly, visible. He reached out and took her hand, not the grip of a master, but the handshake of an equal. You were right, Zora, he whispered. I thought the rules didn't apply to me. I forgot that the truth is the only thing that doesn't need legs to stand. The glass pavilion reopened its doors on a crisp, salt-tinged evening, but the light that flooded the dining room felt different. The heavy, smoke-tinted glass had been treated to remain clear, allowing the ocean's horizon to bleed into the room without obstruction. The oppressive weight of the glass fortress had vanished, replaced by a warm, melodic hum of conversation and the clink of crystal that no longer felt like a countdown. The restaurant was no longer a stage for the underworld's shadow plays, it had become a sanctuary for the city's light. Zora Vance stood at the center of the floor, her posture as poised as ever, but she no longer wore the starched, invisible apron of a servant. She moved through the room in a tailored charcoal suit that commanded respect without the need for a raised voice or a pointed finger. As the new manager and co-owner, a partnership sealed not in blood, but in a shared respect for the truth, she moved through the tables with an authority that had earned her a new title among the regulars and the staff, the Queen of the Pavilion. She was the heart of the establishment, the one who ensured that no one, from the wealthiest patron to the youngest busboy, was ever made to feel invisible or small again. Shin Jin-ho was there, too, seated at his usual table by the window. The bodyguards were gone, replaced by a discreet, professional staff that served the man, not the myth. He looked out at the water, a cello bridge resting on the table beside his hand, a reminder of the music he was finally learning to play again. He wasn't a monolith or a legend in that moment. He was a man who had reclaimed his word, finally at peace in a world where transparency was the ultimate protection. The story of Zora and Jin-ho remained a whispered legend in the Hamptons, a powerful testament to the impact of truly being seen. It served as a reminder that integrity is the only true currency in a world of artifice. The educational value of their journey lay in the dismantling of biases. Zora had learned that righteous fury is only just when tempered with the truth, and Jin-ho had learned that true power isn't found in physical dominance or fear, but in the courage to be vulnerable. Together, they had proved that no one is truly invisible, and that a single act of integrity, a waitress refusing to look away from a monster, could dismantle an empire of shadows and rebuild it into a kingdom of light.